That's my screen I have up now.
Yes.
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 Indeed. Yep.
Okay. I will run through the images to just show you the challenge. Actually, yes, we'll do that first. Still see it? Yes?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, here's the image I sent you. That's a phenomenal location in northern Italy, and those are the Dolomite Mountains. It just really,
Yes, sir.
the end of the day was just wonderful. And I've talked about the aspects of an image that the shadow should have detail. Ansel, I shouldn't say I just talked about Ansel's definition. Shadows should have detail where the mind thinks it should see into them, and the highlight should have detail or texture where it would expect to see it. So I sent this one as a first time for you to work on as a black and white because it has those aspects. There's detail in the shadows, there's detail in the highlights. So the challenge is really to learn how to do a black and white. Let me show you my version of this. This is my conversion into black and white. And I will be talking about a number of aspects of the foreground highlight and this middle ground beyond the darker foreground trees. You see that highlight on the mountain there in the background, and then the mountains themselves and the clouds. And if we go back to Ansel's definition of dark light, I have a little bit of dark in the foreground, light in the foreground, then darker area, light area, darker area, light area. That creates that 3-dimension that he always did in his prints. So this is mine, and I will certainly point out some aspects about the highlights down here in the foreground in comparison to the highlights back here at the base of the Dolomites. So let's look at some of the images, I think.
Mhm.
If I can make it work. Yeah. The only part about this is I don't see the name. So let me do it this way. Can you still see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
This is Barry Wright's. And Barry, you handled all these issues that I talked about very well. The aspect though, is you see this highlight at the base of the Dolomites, that's actually brighter than the highlights down here. And so you want this highlight at the base to be brighter than that back there. So you would need to be burning midtones to darken that back in that area, and over here on the right of the image, and then up in the sky, that brighter area up there to darken that so that you get the detail in those areas. But overall, you've handled this really well. Those are the subtleties that you need to do when you convert something from a color image to a black and white, to look at how do those tones come across in tonal range and in density. And Bob, I know you're new to this, so I understand. You see the brightest area is here at the base of the mountains and then down here, and you've lost detail throughout those. So I'll cover more today, not more, I'll cover today how to get a good black and white conversion. And this is Dolores. Dolores, you really did a good job. You see what she's handled here at the base of the Dolomites, which is darker than the highlight down here. When you just convert this, you think, oh yes, those will be handled by the black and white. That's true, but you really, in black and white, need to do additional work to bring out that area that you want the viewer to concentrate, where you want the eye of the viewer to concentrate, which is down here and not up in this area here. So you handled that really well. The only aspect is up here in the sky. Whatever technique you use to convert just blew out the highlights in the sky area. But overall, the shadow areas are handled really well, all through here, through the mountains, down through the trees, handled really well. And Diane, you did a very good job. Look at the subtleties you have all through here. And you see the difference of the darker areas here in the center and the lighter trees here. So you've brought out that aspect more. And this is darker, but it's about the same highlight tone as down in here. Now, all of that sounds like, geez, John, you're really getting picky. Well, when you create a very good black and white, it's important to be that picky about where the highlights are and what you're doing with them. And you've handled this part of the mountains well. I think a little bit darker here, a little bit darker here, and you've handled this highlight up in the clouds very well. Just a little bit more mid-tone darkening to darken that area. But also, what I've talked about last week with Ansel's is he was always aware of something dark against light. And you have that dark peak against light, which creates 3-dimension. You have the dark trees against the light area of the mountain here, 3-dimension. You have the dark trees at the base against the light area in the center, 3-dimension. Handled really well. Your tonal range are very good throughout. The mountains back here handled really well. Ian, you've done the same thing very well. The darker or the lighter area at the base of the Dolomites here where the trees are, you've darkened that, which works really well. You have great detail up in the highlight areas. Could darken this side of the Dolomites here on the right-hand side just a bit, and maybe lighten some of the trees a little bit. The overall aspect of this image on my monitor, keep that in mind also. What I'm looking at is my monitor, and your monitors could be calibrated differently. The only other thing I would consider doing on this, Ian, would be to lighten this foreground a little bit more so that it is the center of interest immediately when the eye comes in. This highlight here is about the same tonal value as the highlights at the base of the Dolomites. This is Jeffrey. Jeffrey, you've done a great job. This down through here, through the trees, handled well. The sky's handled well. I think just a little darkening of the sky and a little opening of the shadows on the face of the Dolomites. The highlights here in the foreground are almost the same as the highlights at the base of the Dolomites here. So we'd want to darken those just a little bit. But overall, the image flows well. The tonal range works very good. Jim?
Thank you.
What's the difference? Watch the difference of here to Jeffrey's in the sense of opening the shadows and the overall lightness of the image. What you have here is a very dark presentation overall. I think it's just a matter of using, if you're using Photoshop, to use levels adjustment, open up the midtones, or curves, which would open up the midtones. All this is dark nicely, but you see you've lost detail in most of the dark areas throughout the image. Joyce? Very close to what we've talked about before. Difference is only in that this upper part of the sky needs to have detail in it. Darker areas in the trees here should be lightened, and this area back here darkened. So as I go through them, you'll hear the same repetitive comments based on the tonal ranges of those areas. If you think about this, and I'm not picking on this image at all, I just want to use it as an example. If I flip this image around upside down, where does your eye go immediately? Right here in the sky. It is one way, a technique that I learned a long time ago, to take a look at where the eye is going based on the highlights and the shadows. You see, brings it right there. That's not where you want the eye to be. So that would be something you need to handle. And I want the eye to be here. So this needs in the foreground, just in this area, lower foreground, a little brighter, and back here a little darker. This overall is too light in the sense of taking advantage of the darker areas of the mountains that could be against the highlight areas of the background. And just needs a little bit contrast range, that's all. Everything else you have, but once you put the contrast in, you then will need to darken these areas here and here. The more that you work with a black and white image related to highlights and shadows, the more you will spend finishing with dodge and burn.
Thank you.
Overall, you're handling the range of things. It's just a little flat. This is an example of what typically I would call a flat black and white. It needs a little more contrast. The darker areas should be a little richer, dark black, not pure black, but a little darker, and that they have more contrast against some of the lighter areas. Michael, who is a very close friend of mine and very good at things, here's his image that he sent to me. I love it. They put in the Star Wars figures.
Uh,
And
It's
I
awesome.
sent back an email saying, oh, bummer, Michael, you must have gotten there right after I did, and they came in. I didn't know they were coming in. He put them in there. Here's the ship up here and here, but look at his tonal range. His tonal range on this image is handled very well. And see how he has this a little brighter down in through here than back in this area. The trees are a richer tone of shadow, and it's certainly up in the mountains with good detail in the shadow areas, and he's handled this area well. Then he sent this one and he said, oh, this is Lake Dolomite. So he created the lake with a reflection of the upper part of the image. Stella, you did a very good job. Handled the foreground very well. I think a little too much brightness down on these trees, which allows the eye to flow from this area into the trees. So if you had darkened those a little bit, we'd keep the eye here. And this area, again, at the base of the Dolomites, be a little darker, and over here, and to see the comparison of these three tones of light gray, they are all about the same. Sky has good detail in it, handled that really well. It's just that you don't want the eye coming up into this image up in here and then through here. Overall, I hope the experience was this, that you learned how, and they already knew how to convert something to a black and white. And I'll explain why we started from a color image, and what could you do to handle the various tones and how you need to do something other than just convert it to black and white. In fact, let me go into now, we change this and go to